to actually reduce the amount of work and increase the amount of leisure, to give a better life for us, our children and our grandchildren, by actually redistributing the fruits of this technology. Now, if we take that way, it's got to be a far, far better world.
RMC is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your retro gaming with their joysticks featuring genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery.
Hello cave dwellers, and welcome to part 3 of our BBC Micro series, in which we learn about the history of the machines while nurturing them back to their former glory. So far in the series we've learned why the UK decided this machine was needed at the highest level, the heart of government itself, and we've seen the inside of the machine while recapping the PSUs, which all have a nasty habit of exploding if you don't. Today we dive back into the history lesson and ask what happened next. But we start by taking a trip to the paint shop to see if we can make our BBC Micros look like new, or is it better to let them grow old gracefully? This of course meant scrubbing, lots and lots of scrubbing, to get all of the cases as clean as possible and ready for painting. You don't want to use any harsh chemicals for this job, just some washing up liquid or car shampoo is sufficient, and a soft brush to get into the textured surface of the beeb. And lift all of that dirt. Believe it or not, I streamed myself on Twitch cleaning BBC Micros and people seemed to enjoy watching it. There I am in my apron, so maybe we'll do some live washing up again in the near future. Here are the clean cases. The tops are paired with another's bottom half, so you can see how they've all succumbed to different stages of yellowing. The original colour isn't a white, it's a light cream colour, which is best seen on the inside of the case, so that's what we're trying to achieve, that colour there. I then went to visit my friend James, who repairs crash damaged cars, and we conducted some experiments in painting in his lockup. You can try this at home as we're using spray cans and not special equipment, and I'll list all of the paint used and all of the parts that we use in the video description to help you. James and I experimented first with the most yellowed and beaten up case, first gently keying the surface to help the paint adhere, but not too much because there is that nice texture on the case and we don't want to wear that away. Then using the spray cans, which James had warmed in a bucket of warm water, we gave our first case a primer coat. And this is where we learned our first lesson. It really didn't need this much primer to get a good result. I mean, we got a great result, we just had to use more paint to do it to cover up the primer. Here is the top coat going on, and you can see these particular spray cans have a really nice wide nozzle on them. James then rotates that nozzle between coats to make sure that the paint gets into the relief of the textured case, but without putting so much paint on that we lose the nice textured finish. And finally, a clear coat was applied to protect it, and this particular lacquer is the result of years of experience at the paint shop James works at on interior car repairs. This lacquer, he says, is the most resilient to being touched and not succumbing to the oils that come from sweaty hands. So it should protect our beeb for many years to come, and is a good tip for any respray jobs that you might do. And here then is the result of our trip to the paint shop. We'll start with this one over here. This is the actual machine that you saw being sprayed in the video clips there. This was the yellowest of all the machines, and it was the most patchy in its yellowness, which is why I'm really pleased with the nice consistent colour that we've got as a result all across this machine. It looks a million times better. It was also a bit beaten up. You can see the user ROM port was pushed through, and I've replaced it with this 3D printed replacement, and that looks fine. Otherwise it's all authentic and original. Now, the BBC aficionados out there will probably look at this and say that shade of paint is just a little bit too light, and I would agree with them. It's closer perhaps to an Amiga beige than a BBC Micro beige. So what I did was I left a case with James at the paint shop and said, just see if you can colour match it a little bit better for me. And that's what happened here. He used the same technique as we saw in the video there, albeit with a little bit less primer, and that resulted in the need for less paint and therefore a cheaper job. And you can see it's come down a shade. It's much, much closer to the original shade. Hopefully you'll agree that this looks quite authentic. And this was the BBC Micro that was in the best condition. The user-on port wasn't pushed through. Everything was great. There's no chips or bumps or bits missing off the side of the case. So I'm pleased that this one came out well. This, I guess we'll say, is the trash to treasure machine. This is the one that will get as close to perfect as possible, although we're refurbing all of them. I will put one caveat in there, and I don't know that this will show up particularly well on the video, but I want to put it out there because you might be using the paint spray can codes that I put in the description. And I want you to be aware that if this catches the light just in a certain way, I don't know why, I don't know how, every now and then I just get a little green tinge off of it. Just a tiny bit of strange green luminance. I don't know what that is. There must be something in the paint. I'm happy with it. I'm perfectly happy to take this to BBC Micro user groups and show it off as a mint example, but I want you to be aware of that in case you do it and you're not completely satisfied. You might want to go off again and paint match, and if you do, or if you've painted a BBC Micro in the past, then please do share whatever paint it was that you've used in the comments so that we can make it better for everyone who wants to try it. Paint aside though, the technique was perfect. I highly recommend painting and not retrobrating BBC Micros, and of course that's an easier solution because the keys are black. You don't have to retrobrite or paint the keys. That's where it gets a little bit more difficult. So that's why it works so well in this instance, I think. Now the third and final machine over here is yellowed. We haven't spray painted it. All I've done is wash it, and I think it makes a very good argument for not doing anything. The yellowing on it is consistent rather than patchy, which is much nicer than these were. These really did warrant a paint job. And I haven't even replaced the ashtray or user-on port there with a replacement. I've kept its patina. It has its story to tell. It's going to remain exactly how it is. So, what's your preference? Do you like the lighter one that's not authentic? Do you like the one that's as close as possible? Or would you just leave it? I know a lot of people will argue to just leave it. And in particular, that's what I'm going to do with our fourth BBC Micro, which is not on the desk because I went and left it at James's place. So I will grab that for the next episode to show you it. But you saw it in episode 2. This is the one with the volume dial modification and the speaker ports on the side. This one has a sticker on it. It has those modifications. It's clearly been well used, well loved, and has lots of history wrapped up in it. And I can't bring myself to spray paint that one. That one needs to tell its own story. As do other BBC Micros which you may own, which have, for example, the school name stamped on the top, or even written on marker pen on the top. Don't get rid of that. Keep that. That's history. That has to stay on there. But these didn't have any of that. That's why I was happy to spray paint them. So it's a fine balance. You don't want to lose the history. You don't want to lose the story these machines have to tell. But also it's really nice to have one that looks as authentic as possible. Where do you draw the line? We'll come back to these machines, there's lots more to do with them, but first let's dive back into that history lesson. We'll pick up where we left off in episode 1, where we learned why they came into existence, what the computer literacy project is. Now we find out, was it a success? And let's learn all about the TV series, the programs that appeared on television for the best part of a decade to support the project. What were they? What did they look like? Let's find out. Computer literacy is knowing enough to be in control of the computer, to make it work for you instead of being confused, or worse, fearing it. The Computer Literacy Project aimed to make the UK the most computer literate country in the world, and in the words of David Allen, the project editor, the aim was to democratise computing. We didn't want people to be controlled by it, but to control it. Even before the BBC microcomputer was launched in December 1982, the Computer Literacy Project was in action, with responsibilities for delivering the project reaching every part of the British Broadcasting Corporation. TV, radio, engineering, publishing, it was broad and ambitious, and the precursor to the launch of the BBC microcomputer was TV series The Computer Programme in January 1982. While the BBC Micro itself wasn't available yet, the show was meant to inspire those who were curious about the new technologies appearing in the stores. As the BBC is publicly funded, it couldn't be seen to be acting in an anti-competitive fashion. It existed to serve the public, and with micros from Sinclair, Commodore and many others appearing in the shops, it was in the public's interest to learn more about the technology rather than to wait for the BBC microcomputer and tie it all in a big, profitable commercial bow. This was public service broadcasting. The BBC Micro launched in December 1982, and shortly after that came the next TV series, Making the Most of the Micro. This was in January 1983 and was presented by Ian McNaught-Davies, a face who would become familiar as he presents many of the shows that we'll see today.
But today, even the humblest personal micro is capable of displaying graphics, in other words, pictures, and many of the principles are the same. But even if you look at a single character on the screen, it's made up of lots of dots or pixels. Here's a magnified view, and you can see the dots.
This series was a very practical one, aimed at showing you applications of your computer and demonstrations of getting started with certain aspects of it, like upgrading to a disk drive or starting to learn how to program. It was more technically demanding than the earlier computer program, but more people now had micros in their hands to practice with, and of course the BBC Micro took centre stage whenever possible on the show. We were now starting to apply the hands-on aspect of the computer literacy project. The scale of demand for the BBC Micro became apparent through 1983 as they flew out of the warehouse. Within 1 year of release, 200,000 units had been sold. By 1986, 500,000 units, and in its lifetime, 1.5 million units sold. Early adopters of the BBC Micro were male, middle class, and under 45 years of age. But as time went on, and with schools taking advantage of the 50% government subsidy when purchasing the Micro, they took a larger share of sales. Over 80% of UK primary schools would have a BBC Micro in them, and 92% of secondary schools. As a home computer, it was less popular, with home users favouring the low-cost ZX Spectrum or the Commodore 64, both released in 1982, and it didn't do too badly with small businesses. In 1983, we saw 25% of BBC Micro sales to schools, 35% to home users, and 40% to business. But with 90% of home machines being used only by the person who purchased it, typically a middle-class male, those school sales touched many more lives and influenced many more young, impressionable minds per sale than those sitting at home.
And I think you will have seen today, looking at some of the activities, that many of them have to spend a great deal of time away from the machine, even when they're using the machine. So when they're doing an activity as they are today in creating a newspaper, an awful lot of time is spent talking in groups, in planning, in discussing, in laying out pages, in looking at final products using the photocopier, and it's not all the time sitting at a keyboard. And I think there's this sometimes a worry in people's minds that information technology means children sitting in serried ranks, bashing keyboards, gazing like zombies at screens. And I hope that in the activities we're doing, this is clearly seen not to be the case.
The response to the computer literacy project in that first full year was huge, and so in 1983 BBC TV broadcast Making the Most of Your Micro live, a 2-hour special in which viewers could ask questions and demonstrations were given, one of which, quite wonderfully, was a demonstration of email in which we saw a live computer hack take place on air.
001, and the machine asks what our password is, so no cameras on the keyboard please. The password is that, and Telecom Gold, Automated Office Services, we're through. Mail call.
Computer security error.
I think we have some hackers. I think you tempted some hackers rather too well. Illegal access. I hope your television program runs as smoothly as my program worked out your passwords. Nothing is secure.
Hacker's song. Put another password in, bomb it out and try again. Try to get past logging in. We're hacking. That's brilliant.
Yeah, well, oh no. ACN 019, hi there, Alex from Oz and Yug. Now look, Oz and Yug, just go away, will you? We want to do a demonstration here. Go away.
The first example of live computer hacking perhaps on TV. 1984 saw 3 more series and the focus shift away from the initial fascination with the hardware and more towards the application of computers and their software. If a nation was to take computers seriously, they weren't all expected to be hardware engineers after all. The next series to be launched were Computers in Control, which focused on robotics, Electronic Office, which you can guess focused on technology in the office, and Micro Live. You'd think they'd have learned the lesson with the earlier live hacking, but a second 2-hour live show was broadcast in the summer of 1984 and a live series then followed.
put the fluence on this one, but it's a shame because leaving a disc under a phone is actually quite an easy mistake to make. And look at that, there's no doubt about the results, disc fault. Still, at least in this case, we do know why that happened. Sometimes you can be as careful as you like with your disc. No phones, fridges, beers, trains, anything like that, and you still get a disc fault. And as Murphy's Law would have it, it'll be a fault on an invaluable programme, the very one that you can't afford to lose.
Being live, this new Micro Live series meant the show could report on more up-to-the-minute tech news than the pre-recorded series, and it ran for 3 years. And this was just the start of the profits which would roll in. There was a lot more to come. Commercial success was not the objective of a public broadcaster, but it was something that they would have to adjust to. Acorn's profits the same year hit £8.6 million, something they would have no problem adjusting to, I'm sure. The TV series that we've seen so far are largely aimed at adults, which is again a reflection of the BBC's funding. It didn't need to change course because the education sector had made it a standard machine in schools. It was true to its original aim of educating the masses regardless of their hardware choice, their age or their position in life. But that educational sector was catered for both by the BBC and by third parties.
I feel that there is enough commercially available educational software at the moment.
For the computers we have in school?
Computers in general.
There is an enormous amount of educational software available, and part of the job of the Teachers' Centre in Croydon is in fact that they stock a far greater range than we have here. So it's our job as teachers to go to the Teachers' Centre, see what is actually available and pick and choose the software that we would like to use in our schools.
It is a general misconception that the BBC Micro was designed to be the machine of educational institutes. It was and remained a machine designed to help those with no prior computer experience to become computer literate. It just so happens though that schools were where so many of us met the BBC Micro, and this is where my first-hand memories fall into view. Now ordinarily I am the storyteller and not a part of the story in these episodes, but this is slightly different. I was a school child of the 80s using BBC Micros, and allow me to describe my own scenario. A school classroom, ancient wooden flip-top desks with an inkwell in them and the names of children from decades past scratched on the inside of them. The chalk of a blackboard, the focus of our attention as a nun taught us English at the front of the class, and the head teacher smoked his pipe in the corner, filling the room with the smell of sweet tobacco. All completely true. It was a quaint and old-fashioned primary school that young me attended, so when a computer appeared in the classroom, it felt like we'd stepped into a time machine. Granted, it didn't capture the imagination of all of the children like it did that of me and a close friend, JP, who begged to use it every lunch break. But all of the students sat and used the machines as a requirement of our lessons. Not computer lessons, but all lessons. TV shows and software would be incorporated into our maths, English and history lessons, and we'd all soon be comfortable in using the machines. In maths, we might write a list of commands such as go forward 20, turn right 45 degrees, go forward 50, etc. and then input these into Logo, a programming language on the BBC and other microcomputers, which should then draw your commands on the screen. Incorporate some loops and suddenly you have a kaleidoscope effect on the screen and lines of colour. And inadvertently, you've started to learn how to program. The colourful graphics and big text really helped to stimulate the kids, but if your school was more well off, then you might even have the holy grail to us kids, the Logo Turtle. And this was a robot that would connect to the back of the BBC Micro and physically draw your logo design using a marker pen on sheets of paper on the classroom floor. This was exciting stuff for cross-legged children and likely their first experience of seeing a robot, what controlled it, and how they could be the ones to be in control of it, how I could be the one to be in control of it. In other lessons, I remember the school TV being wheeled out into the classroom on its trolley, and we'd watched Geordie Racer, a BBC Look and Read series about robberies, pigeon racers and distance runners in the north of England.
The story so far. Spuggy has told his dad all about Baz.
He picked it up for Baz. And you thought I knew? I drove Baz's truck. But I'm he crook, man.
So Dad decided to tackle Baz.
Seems I'm mixed up with a lot of crooks.
Why mixed up's right, man. We're gonna help ourselves to the takings at the recreation centre. Thanks to this bonny little map you drew for us. Best thing you can do is say no.
After each episode, we'd fire up the supporting software on the BBC Micro to track down beastly Baz and his stolen goods while performing English and maths and also some route planning tasks. These are just two examples of how the BBC Micro was integrated into my school and as part of regular lessons. And it wasn't only the subject of an IT lesson. In fact, I don't remember us actually having dedicated IT lessons until upper school. IT was integral to our schooling in these early years, and it became second nature for me to expect a computer to be involved in a task at some point in that task. Computers became normalized for our generation. And the BBC Micro was well suited to deliver this, with graphics modes that gave chunky, clear, easily readable text. It was a machine designed with the input of educators at the design stage with the purpose of educating, and it delivered from primary students through to adults. It wasn't all plain sailing for schools though, as they rarely had a dedicated IT department, and let's not paint a picture of blanket success across the country for the BBC Micro. Outside of schools, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 went from strength to strength, and many machines from homegrown companies came and went, trying to take their share of the market. Machines like the Dragon 32 or the Auric 1, which came and just as quickly disappeared. Outside of the UK, the BBC Micro didn't perform so well. Acorn created a US version of the machine with NTSC video output and an American English BASIC. But while the American PBS TV network aired the computer program, it didn't gain traction. Perhaps because in the UK in 1983 we had just 3 TV channels, but in the US they had much more choice, and the US were also quite satisfied with their own homegrown machine, the Apple II. The project and the machine were also pushed in other countries around the world, with the most success being found in Australia, South Africa and Holland. But it was still not a patch on the success of the UK, despite the efforts of the Department of Trade and Industry. They tried to help promote it, but the sales network of the Acorn, the BBC and the government just wasn't strong enough to make it a success outside the UK. And the expense Acorn went to, particularly in trying to break the US market, was extremely damaging to their own bank account. And here, around 1985, is where our story really forks into two. In one direction heads the story of Acorn Computers, in the other, the computer literacy project itself.
People got maybe overexcited and bought too much and realized that they couldn't do all those things that they thought they might be able to do with it, and people lost interest, especially on the home computer side.
Towards the end of 1984, the initial excitement and enthusiasm for home computers took a dive. A bubble of new machines, undeliverable promises, and a lack of standards across the hundreds of different machines released led to fatigue, and that bubble burst, taking with it many home micro and peripheral manufacturers. This is the same year where we saw Atari sold and Apple were nearly bankrupted. The BBC Micro weathered the storm, however, thanks to its strength in the education sector. Acorn Computers themselves, well, they weren't faring so well. Aside from the BBC Micro, Acorn had produced the Acorn Electron in 1983, but problems with the ULA chip in it meant they missed the Christmas sales rush, and further supply chain problems resulted in 250,000 Acorn Electrons sitting unsold in an Acorn warehouse. Financial reserves were being spent on the BBC Master Computer, that's a successor to the BBC Micro, as well as a highly secretive Acorn RISC machine. The project and financial stress was made all the worse by their failure to crack the US market with the BBC Micro and the money that they threw at that. This all came to a head in 1985. Acorn sold a 49.3% stake of the company to Olivetti for £12 million. By September 85, Olivetti had taken a 79% share and control of the company, and with it, a technology so secret that they didn't even know they were buying it, the Acorn RISC Machine project, or ARM. Let's not lose our focus here though, this is a series specifically about the BBC microcomputer, so suffice to say, Acorn continued to make computers under the new management of Olivetti, including the BBC Master, a successor to the Micro in 1986, which sold around 200,000 units, and the Acorn Archimedes, the machine that would use their new RISC or ARM processor. The BBC Micro, though, would live on in classrooms into the early 90s, in some schools dutifully offering its educational titles and occasional video games which had been sneaked into the disc box, perhaps relegated to the younger students and taking a back seat to the newer, faster and flashier Archimedes machines, the earliest of which was named the BBC Archimedes computer and had the owl logo of the Computer Literacy Project on it. Before 1980, the relationship the UK had with computers was minimal outside of universities and very specialist environments. As we've learned over the last 3 episodes, the BBC Micro here, coupled with the Computer Literacy Project, played no small part in changing all of that over the best part of a decade. Of course, it didn't do it in isolation. There were other success stories like Sinclair's low-cost computers and Commodore's machines with their lovely custom chips, as well as many others which ignited our imaginations in the UK. But the Computer Literacy Project and the BBC Micro was the strong undercurrent to it all, always keeping computing in the forefront of the nation's minds. And for a generation of schoolchildren, computing wasn't just turning mainstream, it was completely normalised. To some like me, that BBC Micro in the classroom was exciting, but to others it was just an alternative to, say, a VHS or writing in an exercise book as part of the lesson. What this wasn't was scary anymore. By the end of the BBC Micro and later the Computer Literacy Project at the end of the 80s and moving into the early 90s, it would be fair to say that the nation was more computer literate than when the project began. I believe the BBC and the Computer Literacy Project had achieved its goal. Without the project and that attention to computing being pushed in the mainstream anymore, and without a driving force or a joined-up direction for IT education in schools, many think the UK took a step backwards and failed to capitalise on the momentum gathered during the 80s with our new confidence in IT. There is concern about this, and many attempts have been made to repeat the project in the modern day, from affordable hardware such as the Raspberry Pi, Arduino or the BBC Microbit, to attempts at another full-scale computer literacy project such as BBC's Hello World project, which surfaced in 2012, looked set to repeat the original project with modern PCs, and then vanished again before it was launched. And something that the original project didn't manage to do that still reverberates today is to address the gender gap in IT. I'd be surprised if we ever see a duo of custom hardware and literacy project on the scale that the UK produced in the 80s ever again. The BBC Micro was a product of its time. The project, a forward-thinking and well-executed one, which is perhaps beyond the shorter-term thinking that we see in present-day governments. Consider, though, the national conversations that we still have today, not just in the UK, but around the world. Will my job be automated in the near future? Just because we can automate something, for example, supermarket checkouts, should we? Is it irresponsible on the part of the employers to do so? Should we collectively benefit where automation is applied and not just the shareholders? And should I be afraid of artificial intelligence and data gathering of my personal information? These questions all sound very familiar and echo the same hopes, fears and anxieties that prompted the creation of the Computer Literacy Project and the BBC Micro in the very first place. There is, without any doubt whatsoever in my mind, a place for such a project in the modern day. Join me soon for our final part in the series, and also an interview with Steve Ferber, the principal designer of the BBC microcomputer itself. But until then, we're going to close today's episode with your very own thoughts on the BBC Micro. What exactly did the BBC Micro give to you? Until next time, thank you for watching and take care.
The BBC Micro gave me my passion for computing and then later on my career.
The BBC Micro gave me the ability as a blind person and student to do schoolwork and to play games, just like my sighted counterparts.
The BBC gave me my future. I did A-level in computer studies on the BBC and learned to program.
The BBC Micro gave me a start into computers. From that special place in school, I wouldn't be where I am now without that exciting inspiration.
The BBC Micro gave me a very good reason to apologise 40 years later. You see, when I was a kid, I was fortunate to own one of these, meaning that I knew more about the inner workings than any of my poor teachers at school, something which I took advantage of. Before the start of every computer study lesson, I would dash around to all the machines in the school and enter the peek and the poke codes to garble the screen and to lock up the computers, making them unusable. Something that my classmates found very amusing, but the teachers surely found extremely annoying, and they never discovered who the culprit was.
The BBC Micro gave me my O-level, probably. I mean, we had one in class that was between about 30 people all trying to get on it. So because of the lack of machines in school in 1984, I used to use my auntie's all the time, and pretty much wrote my project for my O-level finals at her house, and at the same time discovered that she owned stacks of games.
The BBC Micro gave me confidence. I wasn't very studious or academic at school, however, I could code on one of these things.
The BBC Micro gave me a career in computers that still goes on to this day.
The school that I was at had a network of BBCs, and we did work on them, printed on them, did all the usual things. It also taught me about BBC Basic, and I wrote a couple of basic adventure games, and that was fun.
The BBC Micro gave me my first chance to program a computer at the age of 7. Bearing in mind this is 1992 and my school was a little bit behind.
I still have my logo programs. I think they would run if I typed them in today.
So the BBC Micro was really important to me because it was the first proper computer with a proper keyboard that I was able to access alongside the teacher that would give me guidance on programming for real. You know, I tinkered in my bedroom with my ZX Spectrum, but it was the first time I had access to a computer that could really spark the imagination and allow me to code programs, something I've been doing ever since, and I've been an IT professional for 25 years. So it certainly stood me in good stead all this time.
And then I discovered that the BBC had got some of the best arcade conversions on any home computer at that time. I mean, I was a real pirate. I had loads of games, played all the versions of Scramble, Pac-Man, Defender, but found that some of the best ones were on the BBC. Planetoid by Acornsoft, nothing to beat it.
On my left is my original BBC Micro from when I was a kid, running Elite, and on my right is my BBC Master, actually running my A-level project.
The BBC Micro gave me an opportunity to annoy my IT teacher. I did this by writing a program that would ignore the inputs as he was trying to run a program and teach the class.
So, Mr. Dillistone, if you're watching this, then I heartily apologise for disrupting the beginning of your lessons.
The BBC Micro gave me a GCSE in computer studies. Yes, I am that old.
I had something to be jealous of, and that's coming from a die-hard Commodore 64 fan.
If you enjoy my content and would like to support The Cave while receiving a completely ad-free experience and access to releases 1 week before they go public, then visit patreon.com/retromancave and join the official Cave Dwellers. Thank you for your support.